So Ian is a master of cybersecurity at Amazon. Welcome on stage.
Thank you. That's a tough act to follow up on, but I'll do my best, especially after basically having 3 different talks line up exactly to what I'm trying to talk about, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with an additional aspect or an additional angle on everything that we've talked about today and everything that we've seen today. And my point is going to be basically that we're involved and we have the capacity to inflict some kind of change, to get involved with the change, with all the elements that we've seen so far. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about how hacking can be applied to legislation, to international law, to government interest groups, and how to affect them. I don't need to intro too much, but just to kind of line up some of the main aspects of what I'm going to talk about, let's just throw some terminology in the air. First one is jurisdiction. We've heard a lot about different hacks, state versus state, criminals versus individuals, and state versus individuals. What we haven't heard is really who takes responsibility or who prosecutes who. And we've heard from Julio before that WikiLeaks doesn't have a lot of entities prosecuting it. It has a lot of friction with governments and a lot of, let's call it non-official friction, like a lot of individuals experience, but there's a question of jurisdiction. We've heard from Kim and from Jess about different hacks and different campaigns. We didn't really hear who's prosecuting who. And we've heard a lot about supply chain. For example, that company in Canada, was it their responsibility? Was it under their jurisdiction to be prosecuted if they're supporting a US company and attacked by a third party that exists in a different nation? And all those questions are super interesting, and the answer to most of the questions that I'm going to pose in the next 10, 15 minutes is very Facebookish-like, which is it's complicated. Attribution is another term that we've been hearing thrown up in the air a lot, and it is one of the favorite terms when you talk to cybersecurity experts and when you talk to big companies that investigate those incidents. And I have a really interesting question to a lot of the companies and a lot of the entities that apply attribution. Before we even get to the legal aspects, is there a selection bias? And that's probably something that Jess can tell you about. If I'm trained, or if my leader or my CEO has a very specific bias towards finding that, I don't know, Fuzzy Bear is actually Russian, am I, as a researcher who's looking at data and suddenly sees some Cyrillic encoding in a binary, do I have selection bias that affects me to write a paper that says this was indeed a Russian involvement? And how does that apply later on when I pass it along to the FBI who is investigating it, and they're looking at it and they're, oh yeah, right, there's Cyrillic in it, and it seems like it's, and my boss, the president-elect now says the Russians are hacking us. What is the selection bias in applying attribution, and are we mixing up 2 different things? Attribution from a technical perspective, which has a very, very limited capacity to actually attribute an action to an actor. Because as we all know, even those of us who are less fluent in the technical terms, it is extremely easy to create the pretense of one entity attacking another. The best example is when I was working with some marketing people, a couple of companies before I started working for Amazon, and they're like, oh, it must have been the Iranians. And I proved to them within 5 minutes that I can show attacks coming in from Iranian IP addresses on our blog. And they were like, oh my God, is that real? I was like, yeah, I'm doing it right now from here, from my office in New York. So how do you attribute? And these are questions that everyone is facing all of the time. Even decision makers in the US, like when when we're seeing DDoS attacks coming in from a command control center that sits, and again, what does sit mean, in North Korea? And the reaction can be in a very formal announcement by US officials that says North Korea has been attacking the Pentagon. Friction. We've seen a lot of friction in the talks so far. All of those, I mean, from a very physical friction aspect, like we've seen in the last video, all the way down to friction caused by cyber attacks. Where do we draw the line? Is it only when it becomes physical, when a generator blows up or a centrifuge gets out of control and starts deteriorating uranium manufacturing? Or is it when an email gets leaked and causes friction in the media? That friction, all of those elements, like we said before and like we had in the previous green room discussion, are basically catalysts for changes in the legislation, in the way that we apply diplomacy and policy between states. No one is really ready for that. And we'll talk about some of the elements or some of the efforts that have been made to increase that readiness. And last but not least, borders and nationalities. In the day of the internet, what are these anyway? We talked about maybe the state's responsibility for providing internet. Where do you draw the line? How do you even define what is, the internet for a specific state? Is it just the .co.il for Israel? Is it the .com for America? I don't know. How do you draw the line? Is it where the router actually sits? That's a private company. So they're not really clear definitions from a legal perspective of what is a border, what is a jurisdiction. And again, the example of me attacking myself from an Iranian IP address kind of exemplifies, how do you deal with a border or a nationality if they even exist in this domain, in the cyber domain. And in order not to win the most boring presentation, this kind of alludes to overreacting, or when you create friction, okay, how do you not just say, oh, let's look at the IP address and see that it's attributed to a certain country. Okay, that's the attacker. So let's talk a little bit about the operating domain. When we talk about all those things, we are basically faced with a new operating domain, the cyber domain, as opposed to the physical, air, land, sea, space. Now we have to deal with cyber, and all the rules, all the legislation that we're used to, that we had very clear definitions on, are getting thrown out, and we need to start thinking about new rules. And who's writing those rules? And as I mentioned before, the shortcut answer is it's us. It's our responsibility to reroute those rules. And what we've seen before, and what we're seeing from WikiLeaks, for example, is a great example of how we break that imbalance, that information warfare, basically, and create some asymmetry, or break the asymmetry that existed before, so that we can make changes. So we have a catalyst from one end. The question is, who affects the changes on the other end? And that's something that, for example, WikiLeaks is not getting involved with for very, very many good reasons, because you can't play in both fields. But some of us can play the second field, can affect the legislation. But a little more about the operating domain. And again, I told you stole my slide before. Let's talk, the operating domain in a couple of examples from the blame game. Again, the latest and greatest from this weekend. Who is really responsible for WannaCry? Is it the NSA who wrote the exploit and and I'm putting GCHQ just to steer the pot a little bit because they're in it together. Is it shadow brokers who leaked the NSA information and suddenly made it public and available to everyone? And is maybe Russia, maybe not? Again, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the border? And how do you define the association? Is it WikiLeaks by inciting and kind of being the spearhead in this whole idea of information asymmetry, and suddenly spurring up many different types of WikiLeaks-like entities. Maybe it's Microsoft who wrote, as we pointed out before, insecure code, but they actually provided a patch a couple of months before the exploit was released. So suddenly they're responsible for it, but based on the patch, suddenly we have companies that reverse engineer and create a working exploit that suddenly exists not just with the NSA, but with everyone, including the group behind WannaCry that uses that exploit. Maybe it's Rapid7's responsibility for publishing a working exploit, and the contributor who weaponized it and provided a usable version of that exploit that you can just attach. Maybe it's the NHS, as we said before, because they are the victim and they didn't do enough to apply the patch that was available. Maybe it's the vendor that received the patch and provided the NHS with vulnerable systems and wouldn't apply the patch. Maybe it's the FDA, who's limiting the vendors from releasing new versions before they're certified by the FDA, but then there's a counterclaim because the FDA actually released an instruction that says if it's a security patch for the operating system, you actually don't have to certify. The blame game can be played in many, many different ways, and this is even before I started drawing jurisdiction lines and state associations other than Russia, because each one of those entities can sit in a different jurisdiction. And we need to ask ourselves, how do those local laws and international laws apply to this? And that's just a very simple example. Some would even say that this was someone releasing something to the wild before it got fully QA'd, as we can see based on some of the artifacts that we're seeing today. So let's talk a little bit about changes. How do we actually affect change? So we've seen the friction on one end, causing the need for a better answer to all those questions I raised before. How do we actually inflict change? And as I said before, in the previous green room discussion, I kind of stole my own thunder. And the answer is we are responsible for making that change. My personal story brings me as someone whose background is super technical. I've been practicing pen testing and red teaming for lots of years, doing a lot of consulting, really in the field, to get involved with NATO and addressing Article 5 from a cyber domain perspective. That was surreal, especially for a kid from Tel Aviv, and ending up sitting in Estonia around the table with 12 generals from NATO countries, and me, who I'm officially not even from a NATO member country, standing up and saying, providing my opinion and my expertise in the field as someone who's been practicing some of those issues that everyone is discussing. And I'm proud to say that I was able to affect that recommendation or that decision on how NATO addresses Article 5 in the cyber domain. And by the way, again, just to simplify the answer, is it's complicated, and the technical elements are not going to be part of that effect. You can't just come in and say, here's a printout of my firewall logs, and here it shows that country A attacked me. All right, NATO, let's go attack country A. That's not how it works. Attribution and all the way down to Article 5 implementation really boils down to politics. So that was a little bit about Article 5. Again, that's a singular example. And that was just me kind of figuring out, oh, this is interesting. I can do that. I can read legal stuff. I can understand how it connects back to the field where I'm coming from and engage with the people who are experts in that field. There are many, many more examples that come into play. And that led me to start working around those areas as well, and all the way back to national legislation. Example like CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It's one of the oldest laws that apply to computer crime in the United States. It's been highly abused to the point of people killing themselves and to the point of people prosecuted for little stupid things and locked in jail for a long time. Whether they're guilty or not of other things, it is very easy to abuse those laws. And the secret is, most of those legislations, Cyber Information Sharing Platform, the SOPA, PIPA, they're all written at the end of the day by interest groups. lobbyists. And you're probably asking, how do I get involved? Well, you can. You can because those lobbyists, those interest groups, are not sitting there together. And we can get involved with other interest groups that have an effect, that have a seat at the table with the legislator. To the point, again, CFAA is one of the legislations in the US that I was kind of involved behind the scenes in crafting and making sure that, that the private interest is also represented, not just the public interest. And the way to do it is super interesting because you have to shed away your own political beliefs. You have to have money, or at least association, again, because money writes those legislations. You have to have some kind of backing of other interest groups that you can work together with, and a little bit of brass balls to just say, you know what, let's affect this. Let's be some of the change that can rewrite those laws. Some of those legislations failed eventually because the market always wins. So SOPA and PIPA have met great resistance from the public, from private organizations. It didn't work out. CISP is a counterexample where we worked with two different, Democrats and Republicans, two different groups to create that legislation and basically hedging the bet, investing money and resources in working with both groups and saying, we don't care who wins, as long as we're with the winning party. So that's kind of the ways to hack legislation and really get involved with the other part of the change. We as hackers, as security professionals, can get involved with one side, which is the friction causing, and the element that causes that dynamic relationships to change weights. But we also have to get involved with the other side because we can't leave that for the other people. We can't throw our hands in the air and say, we caused the friction. We have corrected the information asymmetry in a way. Let's hope that someone on the other side creates legislation or changes legislation in a way that benefits all of us. We have to get involved in both ends, whether directly on both sides or indirectly, and just saying, you know what, I see that someone is doing the work on one end, like WikiLeaks, let's get involved with the other side, because that's more comfortable for me from a risk-taking perspective. Maybe I'm not willing to compromise my entry to the US every time I get back and spend half a day in a small cell. It doesn't mean that you cannot get involved. It means that you can get involved with your local entities. Really quickly summing this up, so we're gonna keep on time. 3 takeaways that I want you to remember from this short description. One is basically be proactive. You can't sit and wait and watch things happen and just hope for them to fall into the right place. If we trust legislators with no experience in the field that they're legislating about to make the right decision, we all know that this is going to fail. We have to get involved. So that's one. 2, you have to map the applicability of law, whether it's national or international, to your specific environment. As a citizen, as a company, as an organization, whatever it is, you have to pick your battles. So pick the ones that cause you the most friction right now. It could be GDPR, it could be Safe Harbor, it could be Article 5, whatever it is. Pick your battles, map to see how they apply to you, which points me to the 3rd takeaway is find others like you. Whether it's a civil organization like I don't know, ACLU in the US, or maybe it's a private sharing program where you find other companies that are affected by those legislations just like yourself and are done with sitting and waiting and hoping for the legislation to work for them. And the force of many here takes a lot. And as a lobby, as a group, going to that table, having a seat at the table, having an effect on that legislation can go a long way, either by removing some of those legislations or affecting them and making sure that they're written correctly. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
You actually have all the time in the world, so let's see if we have any questions for Ian. And it's really dark in the back, so you can actually scream out if you have a question. Also, there was a request from some people, like if they can ask the question in Swedish, and that's fine. I can try to translate as good as I ever can. So, any questions? Great.
Wait a second.
So do you think that it might sound far-fetched, but do you think that we in the future might have some kind of amendment to the Geneva Protocol regulating cyber warfare on civilian infrastructure?
I think we're getting close to it. I mean, with the Wassenaar agreement getting expanded into more technical cyber realm, we're already facing that. And I know that we have a lot of involvement from the community. I personally know a few of my friends who are actively involved with drafting and counter-arguing about Wassenaar. So we're already there. It's not a question of if, it's a question of what do we do with it and how do we get involved around it.
Okay,
and
thanks.
some of it is really damaging. I mean, the way that Wassenaar is interpreted right now might put me in jail, for example, if I travel to specific countries.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah, for you anyway. Just kidding. Just kidding. No, it's really.
Give me 5 minutes with your computer, and you might be in the same boat.
Well, trust me. Well, trust me, I believe that. So I'm not going to give you my computer. Actually, this is just a demo computer. There's nothing important on it.
Sure.
My real computer is not here. It's in the office locked in.